I will start the recording. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. So welcome to the session. And now we will invite Professor and Dr. Kevin Kester to deliver his presentation, Education and Prefigurative Politics, six Pedagogies for Working Toward Peace or Justice Today. So without further ado, the stage now is yours, Professor and Dr. Kevin Kester.
Hi, Andy. Hi, Nagina. I believe it's only the two of you. Andy, is this recorded by chance and put onto the website?
Yes, the committee required us to record it.
Okay, and so it will be available on the site later for everybody to view. Okay, then with that in mind, then what I'll do is I will indeed go ahead and present the full presentation that I had planned, so that those who want to watch it later can watch it and give some thought to what is there. But given that we're a small group, Nagina, feel free at any time to interrupt and ask questions as we go about. We have about 25 minutes or so. So what I've done is I've prepared about a 15-minute presentation, and then I'll open it up for question and discussion between all of us. All right. So good morning, everyone. My name's Kevin Kester. I'm an assistant professor at Seoul National University. And let me share my file with you here. Okay. Today I'm going to be sharing results from an ongoing study titled Education and Prefigurative Politics, 6 Pedagogies for Working Toward Peace and Justice in Troubled Times. And it doesn't say it here on the slide, but this is specifically grounded within the Korean context. So we're offering insights from Korea. Before beginning, I want to thank the funders of this study, which in this case, it's my university, SNU, and 2 of my PhD students, Nikki Gerstner and Rira Sa, who are supporting the analysis and the writing of this work. As an overview, in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to first outline the background and the objective of the study. Then I will overview the Korean context, conceptual framework, and findings before turning to a brief discussion. But before I begin, I want to ask a question here, perhaps rhetorically, and then also clarify what my approach is in this work. So to the question, what are, for those of us who are teachers and researchers, what are some of the social change pedagogies that we are familiar with? Perhaps we engage these in our own classroom, or we've read about them in the literature, and so we're aware of them as an approach in the broader field. I think some of these include global citizenship education, development education, environmental education, human rights education, democratic education, education for sustainable development. And so there's a whole plethora of different options out there for educators that are interested in thinking about and employing techniques to create positive social change through their teaching. But to be clear, these are not singular approaches. So global citizenship education, indeed, within global citizenship education, there are different theoretical, pedagogical, philosophical underpinnings of each of those fields. And it would be more appropriate to discuss them as global citizenship educations or peace educations to acknowledge and be aware of the different undercurrents for how these fields are practiced. So some of these approaches include, for example, structural functionalism. So this is a very common underpinning that people employ when they practice peace education or global citizenship education, often without making this explicit. And here are the approaches to change hearts and minds. So like, my educational approach is an approach to change the way that people think, the way that people behave. And the idea is that if we can do this, then in the aggregate, we create peace writ large. We have social peace if we can use our classroom to change the hearts and minds of each student. This is a structural functionalist approach. And it's very frequently employed throughout the literature and throughout practices of different peace and social justice educators. Another approach is positive psychology. Positive psychology focuses on thinking good thoughts, focuses on being a better you, and it's not really structurally oriented. It's just oriented toward the individual and that individual being more at peace with him or herself. In contrast, there is a critical theory, critical pedagogy, more conflict-oriented approach that seeks to create social change by changing systems, identifying unjust systems within society, such as poverty, such as racism, such as sexism, and working through our education to raise awareness and to raise action toward mitigating and changing those unjust systems. And then there's a symbolic interactionist approach as well, which is, it's very similar to the structural functionalist approach, where we engage with others, and by engaging with them, meeting people, observing them, it gives us ideas and models for how we can practice and change our own engagement in society by observing others. Now, the difference between symbolic interactionist and structural functionalist is symbolic interactionism is from the bottom up, and structural functionalism is top down, but they're very similar. So let me be clear that my approach is critical peace education. This is blending together reflexivity and teacher practices with attempts at changing unjust social systems. And recently, I've also started to talk about this as post-critical education. I'm not going to talk about that today, but you can find it in a file that I've put onto Edzilla. So to begin the talk, pedagogical practices in higher education often operate implicitly or explicitly under the assumption of promoting a better society. But the explicit theories of social change that underscore such pedagogies are frequently under-examined in the sense that I was just speaking of. Many educators unknowingly practice structural functionalism, unknowingly practice positive psychology, unknowingly practice critical theory. They're doing it, but it's not explicit. And moreover, the pedagogies that are employed, such as democratic education, critical pedagogy, transformative education, conflict-sensitive pedagogy, peace education, and decolonial pedagogy, these are the 6 pedagogies that I look at throughout this paper, they're often under-theorized. And so we have an issue here of needing to examine the philosophies and the underlying theories that direct our work. A question that others ask throughout the fields and throughout the literature is, what is the driving theory of social change that you're operating with? So to explore and categorize the varied approaches that university educators make in response to contemporary social challenges, my study employs a comparative literature review methodology that examines diverse perspectives on university pedagogy as a form of prefigurative politics. All in all, I reviewed 206 journal articles and books in both English and Korean with the help of my research assistants. The literature is additionally compared with qualitative interviews that were conducted with 8 Korean-based educators to provide deeper insights into pedagogical practices that aspire towards social change. Here, prefigurative politics is understood as a form of praxis that attempts to reconstruct through education a more peaceful, cohesive, and socially just society, broadly defined. The discussion is focused on the South Korean context specifically, and I'm going to call it Korea hereafter, because this is the context in which I work and from which I write. The primary questions guiding the study include: how and to what extent do university educators' visions and specific educational praxis work toward prefiguratively creating a better tomorrow today, as interpreted by the scholars in the higher education classroom? How are these praxis conceptualized and outlined within the global literature? What are the social challenges that educators are addressing in their responsive pedagogies toward a prefigurative politics? And how and when are different theoretical, pedagogical, methodological, or policy approaches utilized to more effectively promote peace and social change? In the end, it is expected that the comparative findings from the integrative literature review and the interview data contributes to generating good practices and theorizations on the transformative possibilities for education to foster social change, democracy, peace, and transformative learning in and beyond the classroom. I turn now to the Korean context, which is very interesting. Since its introduction in 1949, modern Korean higher education has had strong links to politics and social change, being especially influenced by the roles that student movements have had in democratization and social change in the country. In recent years, this complex relationship has been exemplified as numerous movements for social justice began on university campuses and have swept across Korea, particularly related to gender rights, democracy, peace, human rights, and economic inequalities. For instance, the 2016 Candlelight Revolution started at Ewha Women's University in Seoul, and it helped contribute to the ousting of then President Park Geun-hye from office on charges of corruption. This movement too reflected earlier democracy movements in the 1980s that spread across university campuses and played a significant role in supporting Korea's transition to democratization. For example, the 1987 student protest at Yonsei University and Seoul National University precipitated the change of government from autocracy to liberal democracy. And the Grand Peace March the same year was successful in leading to the broader institutionalization of social movements in society, enabling new civil society groups by providing tools, tactics, discourses, resources, and intergroup solidarity through policy and educational shifts toward democracy and social justice. These movements too trace back to the 1960s and 1970s during the rule of President Park Chung-hee, which many of us are aware is the father of Park Geun-hye, when religious and student movements also converged in an attempt to oppose the then government's suppression of human rights. A major result of these movements was that scholars became more free to vocalize their opinions, to investigate past state atrocities, and to publicly fight for human rights and social justice. Indeed, many of the student activists who participated in these movements later became academics and politicians. This had a direct influence on the move toward pedagogies for democracy, civil rights, and social justice that were introduced formally or informally into curricula and teaching, as our interviews with faculty indicate. In particular, a new focus on peace, democracy, multiculturalism, and social justice education emerged, as also illustrated in the review of literature. Given this intimate relation between higher education and social change in Korea, I now turn to detail the conceptual framework of prefigurative politics. Winnie Bernays argues that prefigurative politics is the attempt to embody personal and anti-hierarchical values, to develop the seeds of liberation and the new society prior to and in the process of revolution, through notions of participatory democracy grounded in counter institutions. This means building community. She goes on to claim the aim of prefigurative politics is to unite the public and private spheres of life. Here I understand to embody and to unite to mean personal embodiment of the values and dispositions for a peaceful society. Related to education, this may mean enacting peace and democracy through curriculum and teaching, but it equally entails the development of a sociological imagination. So this is the critical peace education part that connects and organizes educators with social movements to undo unjust social systems. For example, as Ho and Singh argue, Freirean conscientization and adult education movements in the 1980s in Korea were employed to prefigure a democratic society, both in and beyond the classroom. Specifically, there are three key elements to prefigurative politics: a correspondence between the means and ends of education, connecting the personal and the political, and finding synchronicity between the mind and body, or the episteme and being. Due to time constraints, I'm not going to go into detail of all three of these elements, and I'm not going to present all 6 of the pedagogies, but I'm going to turn to present just 2 of them today: democratic pedagogy and peace and social justice education, because that's the emphasis of the conference this weekend. So to the findings. Democratic pedagogy, practicing what we preach. The literature traces democratic pedagogy back to the ideals of democracy through education and the work of Dewey, Bloom, and A.S. Neill. Here we found diverse visions for the ends and means of education from the right and left of democratic politics, suggesting that whilst the right have been remaking education through neoliberal and managerial traditions, the left struggle to change society as hoped for by socialists and progressivists. Drawing on the prefigurative framework, more definitive ends and means can be seen as academics critique the increasingly closed and depoliticized system. This is evident in how the current educational structures in Korea and beyond push neoliberal agendas of commodification and corporatization of higher education through standardization of assessment and examination, global policies for international comparative data, competition, and obedient consumerism without criticality. As Korean academics then turn toward democratic learning, Lee declares that democratic educators must insist that the area of pupils' autonomous activities should be expanded so that it can provide them with opportunities to practice democratic values and attitudes at school. Now that is prefigurative politics right there. In Korea, Lee is especially critical of how anti-communist education has historically inhibited critical thinking and democratic learning when anti-communism is positioned as patriotic. There is thus a dual critique of capitalism and anti-communist education here. Turning to the interviews in our study, participant 1 shares how he integrates his belief in the values of democracy into his work as an academic, both in his departmental service and in his courses. He explained that as department head, he wants student activism, especially after COVID-19, to be a legacy of his leadership. He says, I would like to see the student activism and student activity as a legacy. In his course titled Law and Social Studies, P1 also leads students to reflect on social movements as a mode for social change, in particular concerning active citizenship and human rights. It is evident here that P1 is integrating social movement philosophy into his courses to guide students toward democratic citizenship, reinforcing the linkages between the intended prefigurative ends and means of education. P1 is intentionally attempting to practice democratic values across his teaching, service, and research. Next. Peace and social justice education turns simultaneously inward and outward. The prefigurative ends and means of this pedagogy seeks to achieve peace and harmony with the mind and body before turning to achieve peace and harmony in society. In so doing, this set of literature critiques education as a modernist enterprise involving the development of rational thought, technocratic processes, reason, mind and body dualities, and consciousness raising. Instead, this pedagogy explores emotion and affect beyond the rational and the modern. This prefigurative strand draws on contemporary peace and social justice scholars such as Reardon, Harris, Bajaj, and Zimbilas to provide examples of peace education as a political praxis. It argues that these peace approaches are a useful and necessary challenge to the earlier rationalist traditional pedagogies, all the while calling for civic action. In Korea, for example, concerning domestic and inner peace before outer and global peace, Kong and Kester et al. Elucidate that peace education is frequently focused on reunification, integration of North Korean refugees into South Korean institutions, and multicultural education for a changing democracy and society. In other words, it's inward looking. Connecting with the prefigurative principle of the personal as political, Park asserts that inner peace education in Korean society is necessary to emphasize peace, unification, human rights, and environmental stewardship globally. This was also evident in the review of course syllabi, where participants 2, 3, 6, and 8 all teach for peace and global citizenship education through their graduate courses, seeking to foster domestic and global citizens. Similarly, drawing on Harris's concept, Cook claims that peace pedagogy is exemplified through key components of cooperative learning, democratic community, moral sensitivity, critical analysis, conflict management resolution skills, and a continuous process of questioning, challenging, acting, and reflecting upon behaviors conducive to peace. Here, participant 4, in regard to Korean higher education, stated, universities really should be doing more to address issues of equity and access. And I think those are all social justice issues and human rights issues for education. There's people who are LGBTQ who are asking and demanding their rights, human rights here in the country. We need more support from universities to help transformation from the top and to be seen as the beacons of how to do things and how to be equitable. In other words, the university should prefigure the type of inclusive society that we aspire toward. With that, I'm going to end the presentation of findings and I move on to the discussion. In the full paper, I discussed two main challenges that emerged from the literature and interviews. First, the literature revealed systemic and pedagogical misalignments. As professors may hold the beliefs and values of the 6 pedagogical approaches, but lack a supportive environment due to the many interactions within a larger ecosystem, such as assessment regimes, social conditions, student experiences, class size, and limited research on pedagogical practices. Now, this is clearly why a individualized inner peace method itself is insufficient. It doesn't address these broader ecosystems. Second, the review of literature revealed a lack of critical inquiry as to who is making the decisions for the educational system and why. An example of this in Korea is the assimilation practices for North Korean refugees, where integration of refugees into existing institutions does not change the structures that reproduce conflict through institutional disadvantage, lack of dialogue, rejection of difference, and other social inequalities. However, the 8 participants interviewed for this study revealed that although the literature may indicate a lack of critical inquiry, the educators themselves, especially those who identify as working toward positive social change, are very much engaged in attempts to interrupt unjust practices in higher education and to promote alternative possibilities. To this end, I expect that these challenges and pedagogies are not limited to the Korean context. Rather, they can be identified and further practiced globally, adapting to individual and social circumstances. The 3 key elements of prefigurative politics, the means and ends, the person was political, and being, may better enable the 6 pedagogies that I've reviewed in this paper: democratic, critical, transformative, conflict-sensitive, peace and social justice, and decolonial education, to interact and dialogue with the calls for transforming higher education around the world. In the end, I hope that the analysis and discussion in the paper serves to better support educators in diverse contexts to teach in heterogeneous ways for peace and social justice today. Thank you very much. That's the paper. I'm going to put here my contact. If you're interested in reading the paper or have any questions, you're welcome to email me. And then let's open it up for some questions. Thank you all for being here. Hi, Aika.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. Sorry, I came a little late, so I might have missed some of the information in the beginning. But it was very interesting to see how these peace-oriented pedagogies, are practiced in the university in Korea. I'm curious, since the course that you mentioned in the findings are, directly related to it was not the language learning course, it looked like.
Yeah.
I, as a language, I'm teaching English courses at this right now in Japan. I just wonder if you have any advice for, making these practices in the language classroom.
Yeah, sure.
If we don't have,
No, it's a great question. So the educators that we worked with, they come from a variety of different fields. I don't think that there was a language educator, if I remember. One was a historian, one is somebody who teaches in an education school. Another one works also in an education school, but teaching sociology. So the professors were mostly teaching content subjects. But I think there's loads of literature and out there that give like activities and suggestions for how to do this in a language classroom. And I think, what's really, if you look at it, and when we have these discussions, like it's really interesting because often language comes up. So I was at AERA earlier this week in the US giving similar presentations. And in our group of peace educators, so many of them work in language context, even though they're not language educators. And so I find that fascinating that somehow language keeps coming back into this. And I think, you know, the primary reason here is language provides us an opportunity. It's a vehicle through which we can explore these conversations. And the question is, what do we look at? Do we want to look at sort of mundane interactions of how to take a bus, you know, how to order food, et cetera, within a restaurant? Or do we want to have discussions of global issues with our students and frame those global issues and have debates and dialogue around those? And I think this is where it comes into a language classroom, is where we can, you know, we're fostering essentially values, and we're fostering critical thinking around global issues. And are you in Japan by chance?
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
Yes.
So in Japan, a lot of the peace educators that I work with also come from language. So there used to be a conference called Peace as a Global Language. I don't know if it still exists, but Kip Cates is in JALT, and Kip Cates is very active in peace education and language learning in the Japanese context and in JALT. So I would direct you toward him. I'll type his name in the chat box.
That would be very helpful. Yeah.
I hope I'm spelling it correctly. I believe it's spelled like this: K-I-P and then last name C-A-T-E-S, Kip Cates. And he runs a kind of a group, a network in JALT called maybe Educators for Global Justice or Educators for Global Issues, something like this. And he has a newsletter that he shares with everyone. And in that newsletter, you know, they share practical strategies that they use in their classroom around global issues. So he's a good one to look up.
Great to know. Great to know. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Leica. Thank you very much. And what is the university that you're at?
I'm at Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful, excellent. Yes, there are lots of great peace educators at Ritsumeikan. Although the ones that I know are in Kyoto. Yamane is very active there around peace museums.
That's nice. Yeah, I'm still new. I just moved like last semester, it seems like the other disciplinary areas seems like more interested in the democracy aspect and the peace studies. So hoping to connect more.
It's a really sort of interesting question about the intersections, as you're saying, between democracy education and peace education, and there are there's some clear reasons why this intersection exists, but some scholars like Kathy Bickmore in Toronto really promote democratic, civic peace education. For her, the approach, what's really critical to her is two things. One, that conflict is at the center. We can't talk about peace without conflict. So we have to address very controversial, difficult issues. And you know, if we're not doing that, then I think she would question whether it's peace education. So one is conflict is central, and two, that civic action, taking action in society, participating in various ways, whether it's through philanthropy or it's through demonstrations and protest, but becoming engaged as a democratic citizen is fundamental toward creating peaceful societies. And so I think she draws a lot from that sort of democratic foundation. So there's a beautiful intersection between them all, Aika. And that's why in this particular paper, you know, instead of calling it peace education, I call it education for social change. And I try to look at the intersections and divergences between each of those fields, because they're quite different from each other, although the end goal is similar, that we want to create a better society, a more peaceful society, but very different approaches from each of them.
I'm still new, and this is very helpful. Thanks so much for.
No worries. Aika, what is your what are you studying? What is going to be your thesis topic?
I actually already finished my thesis. I did in Canada. I was study abroad, but I was more interested in the ideologies and racial linguistics, social linguistic aspect of English. So that was a big part of, and I see that